The autumn of 1942 brought heavy rains to the industrial districts of northern England, where clusters of factories had been repurposed to meet the demands of wartime production. The sky remained overcast for weeks at a time, casting a gray pall over rows of brick buildings that stretched along rail lines and canal routes. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys throughout the day and night, merging with low clouds to create a haze that settled over the surrounding neighborhoods. The war had been ongoing for 3 years, and its presence shaped every aspect of daily life in these manufacturing centers. Materials were rationed, transport was restricted to essential use, and labor shortages had drawn workers from populations that would have been excluded in peacetime. Young people, displaced persons, and those who had lost homes to bombing were absorbed into the workforce, assigned to tasks that supported the military effort without placing them directly in combat zones. Ivan Kowalski was 13 years old when he arrived at a textile mill located on the outskirts of a town whose economy had revolved around fabric production since the previous century. He had been born in Poland and had lived there until the invasion of 1939, when his family had fled westward in the chaotic early weeks of the war. His father had been separated from the group during the crossing into France, and no word had come from him since. His mother and younger sister had made it as far as the Channel coast, but both had died during a bombing raid on the port town where they had been waiting for passage to Britain. Ivan had survived by chance, having been sent on an errand to a different part of town when the bombs fell. He was taken in by relief workers and eventually placed on a transport ship that carried refugees and orphaned children across to England. Upon arrival, he was processed through a series of temporary shelters before being assigned to a group home affiliated with the textile mill, which provided housing for young workers in exchange for labor. The mill occupied a large rectangular building constructed of dark red brick, with tall narrow windows set in even rows along each floor. The interior was divided into several production halls, each dedicated to a different stage of the manufacturing process. Ivan was assigned to the spinning room, a cavernous space filled with rows of mechanical frames that transformed raw cotton and wool into usable thread. The machines operated continuously, driven by overhead belts connected to a central power shaft that ran the length of the room. The noise was constant and pervasive, a rhythmic clatter punctuated by the occasional screech of metal on metal when a belt slipped or a spindle jammed. The air was thick with floating fibers that caught the light streaming through the high windows and settled on every surface, coating floors, walls, and the clothing of workers in a fine layer of lint. Ivan's job was to monitor a section of spinning frames, watching for breaks in the thread and replacing empty bobbins with fresh ones as they filled. The work required attention and quick reflexes but did not demand great physical strength. He stood for most of his shift, moving along the row of machines with a practiced efficiency that developed over the first few weeks of employment. When a thread snapped, he had to stop the affected spindle, tie the broken ends together with a weaver's knot, and restart the mechanism without allowing too much slack to accumulate. The process took only a few seconds when done correctly, but errors could result in tangled thread or damaged equipment, both of which drew reprimands from the floor supervisor. Ivan learned to recognize the subtle changes in sound that indicated a thread was about to break, allowing him to intervene before the problem worsened. The workday began at 6 a.m. and continued until early evening, with a brief pause at midday for a meal provided in a canteen on the ground floor. Breakfast was eaten before the shift started, in the group home where Ivan shared a dormitory room with 9 other boys ranging in age from 12 to 16. The room was minimally furnished, containing 5 sets of metal-framed bunk beds, a single wardrobe, and a wooden table near the window. Heat came from a cast-iron radiator that functioned inconsistently, leaving the room cold on many mornings. Ivan slept in an upper bunk, wrapped in a wool blanket that had been issued upon his arrival. He woke to the sound of an alarm bell rung by the house supervisor, dressed quickly in the dim light, and joined the others in the dining hall for a portion of porridge and tea. The walk to the mill took 15 minutes, following a paved road that ran parallel to a canal used for transporting coal and raw materials. The road was often wet, and puddles formed in uneven sections where the pavement had cracked. Ivan wore boots that had belonged to someone else before him, their soles worn thin and their leather scuffed and stained. He kept his hands in the pockets of a woolen coat that was too large for his frame, its hem reaching nearly to his knees. The other boys walked in a loose group, their breath visible in the cold air, speaking little as they made their way toward the factory gates. A guard checked identification cards at the entrance, and the group dispersed to their respective work areas. The spinning room was already active when Ivan arrived, the machines having been started by the night shift workers who handed over their positions without ceremony. He took his place along his assigned row and began the routine that would occupy the next several hours. The repetition was both numbing and strangely absorbing, requiring enough concentration to prevent idle thoughts but not so much that the time passed quickly. The morning stretched into afternoon, marked only by the changing quality of light through the windows and the gradual accumulation of fatigue in his legs and lower back. He developed small habits to cope with the monotony, counting the number of bobbins he replaced in an hour, observing the patterns of lint that gathered in the corners of the machines, and watching the other workers as they moved through their own routines. Among the workers in the spinning room was a girl named Margaret, who operated a section of frames on the opposite side of the hall. She was 15 years old, with dark hair kept pinned back beneath a cloth cap and a thin face that bore the pallor common to those who spent long hours indoors under artificial light. Ivan had noticed her during his first weeks at the mill, but had not spoken to her, as conversation was difficult over the noise of the machines and discouraged during working hours. She moved with a steady, unhurried efficiency, her hands quick and sure as she managed her section of spindles. He observed that she seemed to work alone, without the companionship that some of the other girls maintained through brief exchanges during lulls in the machinery noise. It was not until several months into his employment that circumstances brought them into closer proximity. A mechanical failure in one of the power transmission belts caused a temporary shutdown of half the spinning frames, including both Ivan's section and Margaret's. Workers were instructed to assist with maintenance tasks while repairs were underway, and Ivan found himself assigned to the same cleanup crew as Margaret. They worked side by side, sweeping accumulated lint from beneath the idle machines and wiping down surfaces that had not been accessible during normal operations. The work was less demanding than their usual tasks, and the relative quiet allowed for conversation. Margaret spoke with a local accent that differed from the few English phrases Ivan had learned, but her pace was slow enough that he could follow most of what she said. She asked where he had come from, and he explained briefly, omitting details that were difficult to translate or too painful to revisit. She did not press for more information, instead describing her own situation in similarly spare terms. She had grown up in the town, and her family had worked in the mills for generations. Her father was in the army, stationed somewhere in North Africa, and her mother worked in a munitions plant on the other side of town. The interaction was brief and unremarkable, but it established a tentative connection that continued in small increments over the following weeks. They began to acknowledge each other with a nod when their paths crossed on the factory floor or during the midday meal. Occasionally they found themselves walking in the same direction after the shift ended, and these walks became opportunities for conversation that neither sought out explicitly but both seemed to welcome. Margaret showed Ivan shortcuts through the town, routes that avoided the busiest streets, and offered some shelter from the wind. She pointed out landmarks that had significance to her, a park where she had played as a child, a shop that had closed when its owner was conscripted, a row of houses that had been damaged in a bombing raid the previous year. Ivan listened more than he spoke, finding comfort in the ordinariness of her observations and the steady rhythm of her voice. Winter arrived early that year, bringing frosts that turned the canal water sluggish and coated the mill windows with ice on the inside. The heating system in the spinning room struggled to keep pace with the cold, and workers wore extra layers beneath their uniforms. Ivan's hands grew stiff during the early morning hours, making the delicate work of tying broken threads more difficult. He developed chilblains on his fingers, painful swellings that itched and burned when exposed to warmth. Margaret showed him how to wrap his hands in strips of cloth during breaks, a technique her mother had taught her. The small gesture carried a significance that extended beyond its practical value, a recognition of shared hardship and mutual concern. The rhythm of work continued through the winter months, each day blending into the next with little variation. Production quotas remained high, driven by military demand for fabric used in uniforms, tents, and other supplies. The mill operated at near capacity, and workers were expected to maintain output despite the cold and the extended hours. Fatigue became a constant companion, visible in the slowed movements of workers at the end of shifts and the increased frequency of minor accidents caused by lapses in concentration. Ivan noticed that Margaret seemed more tired than usual, her face drawn and her hands moving with less of their customary precision. He learned from another worker that her mother had fallen ill and that Margaret had been taking on additional responsibilities at home, preparing meals and caring for younger siblings before and after her shifts at the mill. The accident occurred on a morning in late January, during a period of particularly severe cold. Ivan had arrived at his station and was preparing to start work when he heard a sharp crack followed by a loud crash from the far end of the spinning room. One of the overhead drive shafts had fractured under the combined stress of cold-weakened metal and continuous operation, sending a section of the shaft and its attached belts swinging downward in a violent arc. The falling machinery struck several of the spinning frames below, smashing wooden components and sending fragments of metal and broken spindles across the floor. Workers in the immediate area scrambled backward, and one woman was caught by a swinging belt, the impact knocking her to the ground. The machines ground to a halt as the power was cut, leaving an abrupt silence broken only by the sound of settling debris and the labored breathing of those who had been closest to the collapse. Margaret had been working 2 rows away from the point of failure. She had reacted quickly, stepping back as the shaft fell, but a piece of broken frame had been thrown outward by the impact and had struck her left arm below the elbow. She remained standing, her face pale and her expression rigid, looking down at the injury without speaking. Blood seeped through the fabric of her sleeve, and Ivan moved toward her without conscious thought, reaching her side as the floor supervisor began shouting instructions for an evacuation of the affected area. He helped her toward the exit, supporting her weight as she walked unsteadily, her injured arm held close to her body. Other workers cleared a path, and they made their way down a stairwell to the ground floor where a small medical station had been established for treating minor injuries. The factory nurse examined Margaret's arm and determined that the wound, while painful and bleeding freely, had not broken the bone. She cleaned and bandaged the injury, applying pressure to stop the bleeding and instructing Margaret to keep the arm elevated. She was excused from work for the remainder of the day and told to return the following morning for a re-examination. Ivan was permitted to accompany her partway home, walking with her through streets that were nearly empty in the mid-morning hour. Margaret did not speak much, focusing on the effort of walking and managing the pain. Ivan stayed beside her, adjusting his pace to match hers and offering his arm for support when the path became uneven. When they reached the corner near her home, she thanked him quietly and continued alone, disappearing into the narrow alley between rows of brick houses. The damage to the spinning room required several days to repair. The broken drive shaft was removed and replaced with a spare that had been kept in storage, and the damaged spinning frames were either repaired or removed from service. Production resumed at reduced capacity while the repairs were completed, and workers were reassigned to other tasks or given shortened shifts. Ivan spent the time assisting with cleanup efforts, hauling debris to a scrap pile behind the factory and helping to realign machinery that had been knocked out of position. He looked for Margaret each day, but she did not return to work during that week. He inquired with the nurse, who told him only that the girl was recovering at home and that her return date had not been determined. When Margaret finally came back to the mill, it was clear that the injury had taken a toll. Her arm was still bandaged, and she moved it carefully, avoiding the full range of motion. She was assigned to lighter duties, sorting bobbins and inspecting thread quality rather than operating the spinning frames directly. Ivan found opportunities to speak with her during breaks, and she described the difficulty of managing household tasks with limited use of her arm. Her mother's illness had not improved, and the burden of care had fallen more heavily on Margaret in the aftermath of the accident. She spoke of these challenges without self-pity, stating them as simple facts that required practical responses. Spring came slowly, marked by the gradual retreat of frost and the return of longer daylight hours. The mill resumed full operations, and the pace of work intensified as demand for materials continued to grow. Margaret's arm healed sufficiently for her to return to the spinning frames, though she continued to favor the injured limb and took care to avoid strain. Her friendship with Ivan, if it could be called that, had deepened through the shared experience of the accident and the quiet support they had offered each other in its aftermath. They began to spend more time together outside of work, walking through the town on Sunday afternoons when the mill was closed and sitting on benches near the canal to watch the water and the occasional barge passing by. The war continued, its progress tracked through news reports posted in the factory and discussed in subdued tones among workers. The immediate threat of invasion had passed, but the conflict showed no signs of ending, and the daily routines of labor and rationing persisted without significant change. Ivan and Margaret existed within this larger context, their lives shaped by forces beyond their control, finding what stability they could in the small rituals of work and companionship. When the war finally ended in 1945, Ivan was 16 years old and still employed at the mill. Margaret was 18 and had been promoted to a supervisory position overseeing a section of the spinning room. The announcement of victory brought celebrations in the town, but the relief was tempered by exhaustion and the recognition that recovery would be a long and uncertain process. The mill continued to operate, transitioning gradually back to civilian production as military contracts were fulfilled and new orders were sought. Ivan remained in England after the war, having no family to return to in Poland and no means of rebuilding a life in a country that had been devastated by years of occupation and conflict. He continued to work at the textile mill, eventually training as a mechanic responsible for maintaining the machinery that he had once tended as a spinner. He married Margaret in 1948, in a small ceremony attended by a handful of friends and co-workers. They moved into a rented house near the canal, a modest two-bedroom structure with a small garden in the back. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, both of whom grew up hearing fragments of their parents' experiences during the war, though either Ivan nor Margaret spoke of those years in detail, or with any sense of drama. Ivan worked at the mill for another 3 decades, becoming a skilled and reliable presence whose knowledge of the machinery was valued by successive generations of managers. He developed a reputation for quiet competence, solving mechanical problems with patience and precision, rarely raising his voice or displaying frustration. He retired in the late 1970s, by which time the textile industry in Britain had begun its long decline, unable to compete with cheaper production overseas. The mill where he had spent most of his working life closed a few years after his departure, its buildings eventually repurposed for other uses. In retirement, Ivan maintained a small workshop in his garage, repairing clocks and small appliances for neighbors and spending long hours on projects that required the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his professional work. He and Margaret remained in the same house, their routines shaped by decades of shared experience and unspoken understanding. They rarely discussed the war years explicitly, but the memory of that time remained present in small ways, in Margaret's careful movements when lifting heavy objects, in Ivan's habit of checking and rechecking mechanical systems before putting them into operation, and in the quiet gratitude they both felt for the ordinary comforts of peacetime life. Margaret passed away in 1998, after a brief illness that left little time for preparation. Ivan continued alone in the house for several more years, maintaining the garden and receiving visits from his children and grandchildren. He spoke little about his youth, deflecting questions with brief answers that offered few details. When he died in 2004, his children found among his belongings a small collection of items from the war years, including a faded identification card from the textile mill, a photograph of the group home where he had lived, and a handwritten note from Margaret, undated and unsigned, that thanked him for walking her home on a cold day in January. These objects, unremarkable in themselves, carried the weight of a history lived quietly and without fanfare, a testament to the resilience required of those who had endured the war as children and carried its lessons forward into the decades that followed.